thì thương cho chắc, mà đã trục trặc thì trục trặc cho luôn. Chứ đừng như con thỏ đứng đầu chuồng, khi vui thì giỡn bóng, mà khi buồn thì bỏ đi.
Thiệp thương chàng thì đừng cho ai biết, mà chàng có thương thiệp thì đừng để cho ai hay, rồi ra miệng thể lắc lay cực chàng chín rưỡi, mà khổ thiệp đây
Hello, I'm Rebecca of Monthly Review Press, also known as MR. Welcome to MR Conversations, our way of featuring our authors and their books, and some of the questions that they address in their books, some of the questions that remain unresolved. This is a space in which we invite authors to bring in whatever guests they would like, to behave as the hosts, to lead the conversation. In this case, we're focusing on Dissenting POWs by Tom Wilber and Jerry LEMBCKE, and they made the decision to bring in Vivian Rothstein and David Zeiger, who they have a lot of questions for. So in this case, I spoke a fair amount with Tom and Jerry before this MR conversation happened, and they really actually they're quite curious about Vivian and David's perspective on their book. They're quite curious about some of the pieces of the story that only Vivian and David could possibly know. They did deal with both of them in their book, so they are subjects in Dissenting POWs. But let's see where this leads. Let's see how deep we can get into the microcosm that was Hoa Lo Prison in Vietnam, and see what we can understand about the larger picture, the larger reality we're living in today in the United States specifically. So the subtitle of the book, Dissenting POWs, is From Vietnam's Hoa Lo Prison to America Today, and that's what our conversation will really engage with. So let's get started. You've probably heard of the Hanoi Hilton, or Hoa Lo Prison, where captured U.S. soldiers were held during the Vietnam War. What they did there, and whether they were treated well or badly by the Vietnamese, became lasting controversies. As military personnel returned from captivity in 1973, Americans became riveted by POW coming home stories. What had gone on behind those prison walls? Along with legends of lionized heroes who endured torture rather than reveal sensitive military information, there were news leaks suggesting that others had denounced the war in return for favorable treatment. What wasn't acknowledged, however, is that the U.S. troop opposition to the war was vast and reached well into Hoa Lo Prison. Half a century after the fact, Dissenting POWs emerges to recover this history and to discover the factionalism in Hoa Lo and what drove it. Tom Wilber investigated documentation regarding U.S. detainees in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He spent a considerable amount of time at Hoa Lo Prison itself and dug up some really interesting primary sources there. His research is the source for the 2015 Hanoi National Film Festival award-winning documentary, The Flower Pot Story. He was a visiting lecturer at Hanoi University in 2018, and his opinion pieces have been published in Vietnam News as well. Jerry LEMBCKE was drafted in 1968 and served as a chaplain's assistant in Vietnam. He is the author of 8 books, including The Spitting Image, CNN's Tailwind Tale, and Hanoi Jane. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and he is presently Associate Professor of Sociology Emeritus at Holy Cross College and Distinguished Lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Their guest, David Zeiger, is director of the film Sir, No Sir, the film that told the story of active duty GI resistance against the Vietnam War. He was a staff member at the Oleo Strut GI Coffeehouse near Fort Hood, Texas between 1970 and 1972, and he's going to talk a little bit about that and what the narrative he heard around the dissenting POWs specifically was when he was there. Vivian Rothstein is the former deputy director of the LA Alliance for a New Economy and has been a lifelong activist and organizer. Vivian participated in a 1967 peace delegation to North Vietnam led by Tom Hayden that met with American POWs being held in Hanoi, specifically Hoa Lo Prison. And that seems like a good place to begin our conversation.
So many people, when they read the book, they're going to say, oh my God, what must that have been like? to be as young as you were, and then sitting down with these pilots who had been held prisoner. It was just such an extraordinary situation.
You know, the war in Vietnam was an undeclared war, so they were not technically our enemy. And the Vietnamese brilliantly wanted to reach out to Americans to educate us about what the war was really about. And so I was a community organizer. I'd been an activist in Mississippi in the Freedom Summer voter registration campaign. And so Dave Dellinger from Liberation Magazine was asked to put a delegation together with Tom Hayden to represent the range of people that were active in the anti-war movement. And we met with representatives of North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front in Czechoslovakia. And then a smaller group of us was invited to go to North Vietnam to see the impact of American bombing on the North Vietnamese people. And, you know, the American people didn't know anything. What weapons, what was the goal of the bombing of villages and hospitals, and what weapons were being used? This was all being done with our tax money. Napalm, high concussion bombs, you know, this is what our tax money was being used for. And then we went and saw the sites that were bombed, schools and hospitals and factories and small villages. And so we went on this trip. I was 21 years old. We were the people that the Vietnamese were relying on to get their side of the story out. And so we all felt just an enormous responsibility to get as much information as we could and then to bring it back to the American people. And because it was an undeclared war, the government could not punish us from going, but they did take away our passports because they said the passports belong to the State Department and the State Department does not recognize North Vietnam. And so they took our passports away. And Tom Hayden, who had been to Vietnam before, wanted to visit the POWs, and the Vietnamese wanted us to visit the POWs because our government was saying that they were torturing POWs. And so we went and met with them, a very difficult meeting. They were in their striped pajama prison suits. We were guests of the Vietnamese government. We were mostly young, not experienced in diplomacy, not aligned with the military in our own country. We tried to figure out who we were in relationship to them and to the Vietnamese hosts. But we did see that people were given medical care. The first person we met with had been shot down about 2 weeks before and was in a cast. I think you mentioned in the book that it was very complicated to meet POWs as a guest of the Vietnamese and get any sense of how they felt about the war. And, you know, it was a very unequal situation. They were prisoners and we were guests. And who did they think we were? So I think for us, it was very clear that there were people who were getting well fed, that they were getting medical care, they weren't being brutalized. But for us to judge what their attitudes were about the war, for one thing, was really not our job. Our job was to get the US out of Vietnam, not to try to, you know, figure out this nest of accusations and lies. And but it was very complex. So I loved reading, Tom, your stories about your dad, what he was able to do under those circumstances and how he held on to his principles and his beliefs. It is really remarkable.
40% or so of the prisoner population was against the war. They had opportunities to recant, and which meant that they would be forgiven everything within that period and it wouldn't be brought up later. But 10 of them clearly, the focus of our book, did not recant.
Was it after they saw what they had bombed? Was that the turning point? You know, when they flew over the countryside and saw what they were destroying?
You know, perhaps that's a factor, but I think a lot of it was being able to stop and slow down and think deeply. The worst problem was boredom and waiting. But that also gives you time to do things with your mind and to think about things and to really examine, some cases in a very introspective way, what got you there.
I think that having time to reflect on the war, I can tell you from my own experience, having been in Vietnam in 1969, that is a really, really important part of the change of mind. Vivian, you also wrote in your journal that you kept, which by the way is a wonderful thing to read too. It's at Radcliffe Library in Cambridge. But you wrote that Kerrigan, Larry Kerrigan, the POW, said that it was reading Felix Green's book, Vietnam, Vietnam, was the title of the book, that, quote, kind of changed my mind about the war. Right? It's also reading books.
We met 3 POWs, and the first was Elmo Leonard, who was injured, and we didn't really engage with him except to just wish him well and take letters from his families, and really at the direction of the Vietnamese, not that they felt that he was in very fragile shape. And then Kerrigan was the adult who really talked a lot about politics, and then Hegdahl was this kid, this sailor who he didn't know where he was or who he was. But Kerrigan, he was so adamant. And yeah, it wasn't so much brainwashed. What we thought, at least I thought, was that he wanted to get good treatment. And if he said the wrong thing, maybe he would get punished for it, both by the Vietnamese and by the US. And then we met with Hegdahl, who was a Navy sailor who had fallen off a 7th Fleet ship and was rescued by a Vietnamese fisherman. And the Vietnamese told us he was treated differently. He could walk around Hanoi. They didn't consider him an enemy of their people the way they did consider the pilots as professional soldiers who knew what they were bombing. And they had a very different feeling about the pilots. Yeah, it was a very complicated experience. I could go on, but it's the whole issue is so complex.
You know, a couple of touchdowns, if you can stand that metaphor, in your journal, Vivian. One was they've got prisons back in the States too. Meaning he was speaking to you, and he was saying, when you get home, don't quote. He said, don't quote me on that, on his having changed his mind on the war. He said, don't quote me on that because they've got prisons there. And when I read that, I thought, oh my God.
It was very confusing, and our delegation had a lot of arguments about what was really going on in this discussion, and it was a very difficult discussion with the Vietnamese, so very sensitive. In terms of communicating with the American people when we came back, I had borrowed $1,200 to make this trip, and I had to earn the money to pay it back. And I spoke hundreds of places. Sometimes I'd get $10 or $25 from a church or a school.
Really?
I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of groups. I was interviewed a couple of times. The media was not that interested in what we had done. And I got hounded by right-wing groups about, you know, having traveled, and I lost a job over it. The FBI visited my employer and said I was the second most dangerous person in the state of Illinois.
Wow.
Who was the first?
I don't know. I've always wanted to know.
Al Capone.
Vivian, what year was this?
1967. I was 21 years old.
So this is during the early bombings of North Vietnam. This isn't during the 1971 what was the big campaign that Nixon launched. This was
linebacker. So that was the Rolling Thunder period, which ended October 68. Yep.
This was the period when our government was saying they were just bombing military targets, and Hanoi was pretty much evacuated, and people were living in the countryside. And the Vietnamese had put red crosses on top of their evacuated hospitals, and those were the ones that ended up getting targeted and bombed.
And then this bridges back to David, who was very involved with the anti-war GI movement. And of course, I'm curious to know whether David heard Vivian's reports as the war went on into the 1970s, and Nixon was prolonging the war because of the POWs. Nixon was saying, we're going to keep fighting until we get the POWs back. Then was anybody saying, David, anybody saying in response to that, well, but there are some of the POWs themselves who are opposed to the war, and how do you factor that in?
And I remember the existence of anti-war, and particularly I think Tom's dad, of POWs who had opposed the war. I'm not sure the particular impact that had, to be honest, among where I was and who I was working with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The POWs that we were aware of in 68, 69, 70, when I was at the Strut, were mostly GI soldiers who had been captured on the battlefield by the NLF. And that was a whole different, as I understand it, and I think you go into this some in the book, a whole different phenomenon. The Oleo Strut was a coffee house. It was a bookstore. We did legal counseling for GIs who wanted to file for conscientious objector status, or for the very many GIs who were charged with possession of marijuana, charged with, with AWOL, a whole number of offenses that were being used against GIs who became active against the war for distributing newspapers, etc. Coffee houses were still considered, subversive. Just the very existence of them was, imported from France. These places became kind of havens on the one hand for GIs who were learning about and becoming opposed to the war. Most of them GIs who had been to Vietnam. This was Fort Hood, for example, where the Oleo Strut is in Killeen, Texas, is in central Texas. It was a base, almost all of the soldiers on the base were Vietnam returnees. If you were drafted, you did your training for 6 months, you went to Vietnam for a year. If you survived, you came back and you had 6 months left to basically sit on a base and stew and get madder and madder about what you had to do in Vietnam. And of course, if you're an enlistee, which is a 3-year stint, it's even worse. After Vietnam, the pettiness and the kind of the ridiculous aspects of the military really kind of struck out for people. So these became kind of the center of organizing of GIs while they were still in the military, not just veterans, but GIs still in the military, bringing the anti-war movement onto their bases in a variety of ways.
That explanation of the coffee houses reminds me of a recent discovery we had with the research at Hoa Lo Prison in Hanoi, and finding close to nearly 100 copies of GI press newspapers there that were in the prison library for the Hanoi POWs. And we've started cataloging those, and I have some photographs and have actually tied those to the copies we have here in the US. But those coffee houses were very influential, as you're saying, David. And of course, you're directly involved.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I remember copies of the papers being sent to Hanoi. I mean, there was an organization called the United States Servicemen's Fund that was kind of the central organization that provided support for the coffee houses, raised money, et cetera. And I think they had connections in Vietnam itself, and that may have had something to do. I'm sure it did had to do with the POWs at that time.
Yeah. So we show in our book how that the availability of that information was real, and they did have knowledge of the anti-war movement inside the walls of Hanoi prisons.
Yeah. In fact, the book that was very popular among anti-war GIs in those years was John Smith's book.
George Smith, yeah.
George Smith, yeah. But he became very, very sympathetic to the NLF, to the National Liberation Front, known as the Viet Cong, and basically to the enemy. And when GIs started to question the war, or get involved in opposing the war, a big question that emerged was, who is this enemy? What is it about these people that we're over there slaughtering people to defeat? And so books like his book, that kind of gave some insight into the politics and the culture and the history of Vietnam, became very popular among GIs themselves. So I think that was the only POW experience that I remember us being involved with was that book. My memory in terms of the politics of the POW situation and experience becoming a big issue was when after 73, when they're released, and the POWs then became a cause célèbre, right, for the pro-war, really culminating with Reagan, I guess, but for the forces that were trying to reverse, the the verdict on the Vietnam War, trying to claim either we won or we lost because of betrayal at home, and POWs kind of became, the big heroes. I mean, they were the ones that were, paraded and feted and all that kind of stuff. And it's more in that, it kind of, to me, I'm interested more in kind of how the anti-war POWs fared in that context. And I thought your book was, again, a lot of really revelations about it. I mean, because I don't remember that, that much about how that particular phenomenon kind of played out. But I think that's a really, to me, that's the crucial, aspect of your book is again, diving into this, post-war battle that went on and that continues to today, about, did we win or did we lose, or who was the hero, and who were the traitors, and who was it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
To have heroes, you have to have a non-hero, a villain. And that was the opportunity to manage the Operation Homecoming, these folks as the embodiment of peace with honor, and yet quell that dissent piece. It just reinforced the hero narrative, right, Jerry?
Yeah, look, you can't have winners unless you have losers, right? You can't have heroes unless you have weaklings who gave in, who betrayed, who were disloyal. Right? You can't have one of those without the other. The heroes, that hero narrative, you see, these guys are able to say, we're strong, we're the tough guys, we held out, right? Well, how tough are we? Well, look at these guys, right? We suffered the same thing that they did. They gave in, these dissenters, right? They caved. They gave up classified information. Right? They curried favor with their guards. They met with these communists from the States who came over to visit them. Right? They're weaklings. Right? You get the point. Right? The proof that we're tough is the existence of them. So they become the dissenters, dialectically become very much a part of the construction of the heroes. Right? They become part of it. They become part of that same story. And the heroes, to go back to what was kind of already been said, the heroes are really important. They come home as sort of the trophies of a war that we won. And so in a lot of ways, Americans were able to put the war in the rearview mirror, not just chronologically, but kind of in a twisted way, as a war that we won. We persevered to the end. We stuck it out until we got these heroes back. And now we can move on. When I say it's kind of twisted, right? Because it is twisted, it kind of stays stuck in the craw of American memory. I mean, there's something about that war in Vietnam that just won't go down, right? It stays there. And a lot of conservatives in America are still running politically on that. I mean, you look at Donald Trump's hats, make America great again. Well, when was it great? In their minds. It was largely before the war in Vietnam, right? It was before the war in Vietnam, and we got to go back. Somehow we got to go back. We got to remember that in some way, and And that's the relevance, I think. And I have heard more times than I can count. When I say I'm a Vietnam veteran, they'll say, thank you for your service. It was really terrible what happened to you guys when you came home. It's as if the war itself is not there. Right? People somehow remember, they've been led to remember that the war was fought here. Right? The war was against liberals in Congress who tied one hand behind our back, wouldn't let us fight the war that needed to be fought, and radicals in the streets who demoralized the troops fighting in Vietnam, who gave aid and comfort to the enemy, and kept the North Vietnamese going. I mean, for lots of Americans, the war was about Vivian and David. Like the real enemy was at home. The real enemy was inside the gates. And I think in various ways, more than anything else, that's what happened. I love the way you framed that question, Rebecca. What has pushed the war itself sort of off screen, right? And I think it's the war at home that pushed the war in Vietnam off screen. And so that's what people remember.
Yeah. They're taking on this exceptional explanation of America's defeat by a third world power. And that's a tough thing to face. And it's much better to if you remember something about it, put these heroes to the forefront. And then you can avoid the question of dissenting POWs, or if you're not aware of their dissent, you're left then with the hero myth. And you can then just forever keep repeating Rambo's, nothing is over. The war's at home.
In the lead up to the invasions of Afghanistan and particularly Iraq, lead up to the invasion of Iraq, there were the largest demonstrations against invading Iraq in the history of this country.
Yeah.
As soon as the invasion happened, those demonstrations literally disappeared. And it was all, and I remember I remember vividly sitting in a meeting of a coalition that had, was planning demonstrations, whatever. And the mantra was, we cannot do what they did during the Vietnam. We cannot do what the anti-war movement did during the Vietnam War, and blame our troops and betray the troops. So literally, once the mantra became, once our troops are on the ground facing danger, you don't protest. You don't try to, because the minute you do, you are betraying those troops. And this was across the board. I mean, you can see it in terms of what's gone on. I mean, in the years of the Iraq War, when horrendous actions were exposed by the United States, about how the U.S. was carrying out the war, about torture, about all of these things, they were met with silence. They were met with virtually nothing in real opposition. And this is a very scary situation as far as I'm concerned. And again, this all goes back to these interpretations of the Vietnam War and what happened, stateside. So I think, and again, I would say, I think what Jerry has done with his books, he's gone after that from so many angles, and I don't think many other people are doing that. Actually, they're not, for the most part. This is a lonely road that you guys are on here, and it's an essential one as well.
I think another message that's used around the Vietnam narrative is that we didn't we didn't do everything we could have done to win. And that was the mistake. We held back. And if you're going to go to a war, you have to go 150%. And the fact is, we didn't hold back. I mean, there was talk of dropping a nuclear bomb at some point, that was a possibility. But short of that, we didn't hold back at all. But there still is this narrative, we shouldn't have walked away. We should have given it our all, which is also very scary for future wars,
Oh yeah, there's very, very much a belief that we would have won Vietnam if we'd have just stayed solid behind the troops sent to fight the war. And by golly, if this comes up again, that's what we're going to do, and we're going to win this time. So yeah, we can win in Afghanistan if we don't defeat ourselves on the home front. We can win in Iraq if we don't defeat ourselves on the home front.
Right.
And Vivian, you're right. It just goes on and on. And David, I mean, the anti-war movement really got cooled out against its opposition to the war in Iraq by this mythology of the anti-war movement hostility to Vietnam veterans. It was like a wet blanket on the anti-war movement. I know I had students at Holy Cross College at the time who were out there in the streets against the war. And then when these stories of spat upon Vietnam vets began to appear, they're coming to me and they're saying, Professor LEMBCKE, what about this? Or, I don't want to be accused of this. And some of them never got past that.
Mm-hmm. Well, another way that the POW narrative plays in is that a lot of people look to the Vietnam War and say there was evil on both sides. Both sides did torture. Both sides were inhumane. And so the POW issue was used to show that this equivalency, this moral a false equivalency between what we did and what the Vietnamese did, they were equally bad. But really, the imbalance was so enormous. And I think that that's still, that narrative is still out there. I mean, it's incredible how the history of the Vietnam War and who really ended it and how it got ended is so disputed to this day. I don't know if it's ever going to be laid to rest, really. But yeah, that's one of the very sad things. And I think this book makes a contribution, a very important contribution around that, all of those narratives. Yeah.
Given the fact that, it did take a long time, but anti-war civilian activists and especially GIs, as your film showed, David, in a lot of ways, and Sir No Sir, did succeed in ending the war. I mean, it was due to them that the war ended, not just because the Vietnamese won, but because those at home won on the home front, right? So why wouldn't peace activists claim that and own that with pride? Why would they want to kind of recoup their image?
I think you have to look at the decades since the war to to answer that, because for example, the myth the central myth of the betrayal of our soldiers is the spitting myth that Jerry went into so beautifully in the Spitting Image, and that myth was so consciously built. I mean, literally, starting, almost immediately when the war was over, these stories started to emerge. And I mean, Hollywood produced something like 200 films about the Vietnam War in the 70s, 80s, mainly 70s and 80s. Not a word about any opposition to the war to the war inside the military, and a ton of stories in these films about betrayal on the home front. I mean, memory gets shaped, memory gets twisted, memory gets implanted literally over the course of decades, in these situations. And I think the other thing is that the politics at the time, that became very sharp, wasn't a question of so much winning or losing the war. It was a question of opposite, that the United States was wrong, that in fact, a victory for humanity was the United States getting defeated in Vietnam, that this was an imperialist adventure. On many, there were a lot of different viewpoints that kind of, came up around it, but there was some general agreement, that emerged that, even on the simple level of the Vietnamese people had the right to decide their own fate, but kind of recognizing this war as a criminal affair on the part of the United States. That has been so fervently under assault, since that time, and the whole, the spitting stories and all of that were part of that. But it's kind of, I think it's difficult to kind of remember, in the way that it was going on at the time, so these memories get kind of, twisted in so many ways. I don't think Iraq, for example, I don't know. I mean, we can go into a lot about Iraq and Afghanistan, but I mean, there is a different context with the 9/11, and but the one of the good things that was going on was that criminal enterprises by the United States, atrocities by the United States, were being exposed as they happened, which was not the case in Vietnam. But even then, I mean, this is what's so horrendous to me, even then, they were not met with anything like not just the opposition that happened during the Vietnam War, but the opposition that went on leading up to Iraq. I think there was also a certain amount of demoralization, on the part of people that were fighting with all their might to prevent, this invasion of Iraq, and were basically shot down.
One of the legacies of Vietnam that played out of the Viet War in Vietnam that played out, unfortunately, in Iraq War and in the media of the Iraq War, is that, I don't know, sometime during the 80s, early 90s, atrocities in Vietnam by U.S. military got twisted into kind of credentials for real manhood. Right? Look at what a bad boy I was. I did this really awful stuff, right, in Vietnam, and that carried over into Iraq. And a lot of these really, really awful guys were taking photographs in Iraq, right, of really awful stuff that they did and posting them online.
Yeah.
And then they're getting recirculated by social media, right? And became a kind of a source of pride, a badge of honor, right? To have done something really, really bad. And the subtext of that, I think, is that war is so awful, right? That it turned me into this bad boy. How bad? Well, look at this. Look at what I did. You see, it's really, folks. I mean, it's really sick stuff, and it's really deep now in cultures of masculinity in America. And again, gosh, what we've done here is, we treat the dissenting POWs as men of conscience. They're not doing this for political gain. They didn't do this at the time to curry favor with the anti-war movement, right? That's not what Gene Wilbur did, or Ed Miller did, or the guys who were captured in the South. That's not what that was about. They did what they did because they knew it was the right thing to do. And somehow we need to bring that, back. And if Tom and I have made some small contribution to that. I'm just so happy to be a part of it.
Jerry, that's interesting because it kind of suggests that if you'll forgive me for bringing in the context I'm familiar with, which is Israel-Palestine, Israeli soldiers talk about shooting and crying. Like, we're oppressors because they make us oppress them. And then somehow we become, we do horrible things to them. It's the classic abuser's rationale. They provoke us into doing horrible things to them. We become monsters, and they're actually victimizing us by transforming us into monsters, that kind of mentality. Whereas the dissenting POW, it is somehow too pure. Like how, this doesn't really work within that narrative. The idea that somebody actually could maintain their sense of dignity, their perspective, even while imprisoned. No one wants to be imprisoned. Prison's a terrible thing. But in the context of prison, they were able to think clearly and come to very different conclusions. And this person that emerges from that experience is not a person that people can make sense of as easily as somehow the soldier who becomes monster. That's somehow easier for people to grapple with or accept.
Oh, thanks so much for bringing. That is so beautiful the way you laid that out, and that so much punctuates, right, what I was saying. So nicely spoken.
Yeah, and very very apropos to Israel Palestine. I mean, it brings to mind the literally hundreds of My Lai type massacres that occurred in Vietnam, all in the name of these people are protecting our enemy. They're forcing us, to go in here and destroy their villages. They're forcing us to slaughter them because they're feeding the enemy. It's the same disgusting, horrific rationale that you see constantly.
And it's interesting, all these efforts to reach out to Americans, be they GIs, students, women's peace groups, POWs, it's really quite remarkable that they didn't carry with them this hatred towards our nation at all. Very few people supported the war. So now they're trying to change the history to change the interpretation of what actually happened. When I was in Vietnam, the Vietnamese said to us that the American people were not their enemy. If the American people really understood what was going on in Vietnam, they would oppose the war. And they didn't see GIs as their enemy. And they made every effort to reach out with leaflets and, of course, broadcasts. And their attitude towards us, they would say over and over, you are the true sons and daughters of Washington and Jefferson. And, they had great regard for our country, but also for our people.
When you said the thing about the Vietnamese saying that the anti-war people were the true inheritors of Washington and Jefferson, on the Oleo Strut staff, that was controversial. We didn't, because Washington and Jefferson slaughtered Indians, and we didn't consider them to be the heroes that we wanted to model ourselves after. I know that was in the turmoil that was going on in the country as a whole. That was one of the of many debates, and issues that were going on. But anyway, that's just kind of an aside.
The majority of Americans in every sector started turning against this war, which I think is where the Vietnamese phrase about the true sons and daughters of Washington and Jefferson came in, that they didn't want us to be so radical that we couldn't talk to ordinary Americans about the war. They wanted us to be able to convince everybody.
I did a lot of work with Iraq veterans against the war. In the first years of the Iraq war, I made a film about, they did a Winter Soldier, Iraq and Afghanistan investigation that was very powerful. But I remember this whole issue came up at that about, well, why isn't there a GI movement emerging in the same way that it did in the Vietnam War? And one person pointed out that, I mean, actually one institution that did learn from the GI movement was the military, because one of the things the easy thing for them to do was to get rid of a lot of the petty, bullshit that people had to put up with, the terrible food, KP duty, all of this. So the military today has outsourced all of that. There's none of that petty stuff that you guys have to. And in fact, one of the guys at the Winter Soldier event told me the biggest problem the military had in Iraq was obesity, because they had, McDonald's, they had Burger King, they had Taco Bell, in the green zone. I mean, it was this junk food heaven. And so, I mean, they've done several things along those lines to try to quell dissent.
Yeah, and on top of that, no journalists are allowed in the theater anymore unless they're embedded with a unit. There's no way that ordinary people like our delegation could go to Iraq and talk to the other side. I mean, so many of the strategies that undermined this adventure in Vietnam have been cut off.
And then, of course, coupling that with, what we've talked about earlier, how we really don't want to unwind something like the hero myth we talk about in our book, because we've got to keep recruitment going. And we have to, support our troops. And that, another war at home, victory at home scenario was really Operation Desert Storm. We may not all recall it, but in the summer and fall of that buildup, when it was called Operation Desert Shield, and we surreptitiously positioned 200,000 troops in theater, quickly flipped that around to say, we've got to invade and save Kuwait because Saddam Hussein is threatening our 200,000 troops, or our troops. So the yellow ribbons took off, and we forgot about that in the past couple of months, over 1,000 active duty military members were protesting against, that buildup. And I think the president at the time said, we've solved the Vietnam syndrome. So that really reinforces this idea that, let the folks that we can hire and recruit take care of this work for us, and the rest of us don't need to worry about a draft. And we'll say thank you for your service, but I ain't going to do that. You do it. Not having a draft is very important to the current recruitment strategy. And it also gives you a certain measure of control, or eliminates a lot of noise in the equation.
The other thing, frankly, is, Saddam Hussein was not Ho Chi Minh. And,
Right.
and the nature of the enemy was not the same. And that makes it much more complicated and difficult, by the way. And by the way, the other, just in terms of military strategy, one key thing that they instituted here was you always were with your unit. You from the time you're finished training, when you're deployed, you're with your unit, and when you're sent back, it's with your unit. It's always, you're with the same people the whole time. So it created this. They're really working on this kind of esprit de corps, with everyone there. And in Vietnam, literally, people were just sent in and out as individuals. They were just shoved into, this unit needs 10 guys, boom, we'll send 10 guys there, or whatever. And it didn't, so there's kind of this psychological game that they play now, that they're much more aware of what creates loyalty and what doesn't create loyalty. And also, I think, the question of what does it mean to win the war or what does it mean to lose the war? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thought, Jerry. Like, what if the U.S. had actually launched a ground invasion of North Vietnam and was able to essentially, conquer Hanoi? What would that have meant? I mean, for one thing, that would have involved U.S. casualties way beyond even what they did have.
David, you mentioned the whole issue kind of exploding when the POWs came home. Well, when we were in Vietnam, what had happened probably the year or the 6 months before was that the Vietnamese had walked or marched some of the shot down POWs through the villages and the towns where people had lost everything. And the Vietnamese were crying and shouting and, to see who had done this damage. And that played so terribly in the American press. And the Vietnamese said to us, we protected them. We didn't let anyone hurt them, even though we knew they had murdered our families. But to the American press, it was this controversial, it was interpreted as torture, which it really wasn't. And that was one of the things we were talking to them about. That action, even though it means something to your people, it was important to their people to see who had done this and to show that they weren't getting hurt, that it really was not working as a message in the US. So yeah, what a complex issue there. We were on the wrong side, and we've never really come to grips with that. And as powerful as the American narrative about the POWs is the Vietnamese narrative now about Agent Orange, which is like a continuation of the war in Vietnam here and there. The impacts are continuing to reverberate. But even McNamara said in his book, which I gagged to read, that we were on the wrong side.
In terms of popular imagination, that the Vietnamese were vicious. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the NLF, were monsters. They were vicious, brutal, mindless killers. And you can't find a film about the Vietnam War that doesn't at some point make that point, all the way up to the Five Bloods. So that's we're not talking about ancient history,
Right.
But the picture, I think that's a very crucial point. The idea that the United States doesn't go to war unless they're fighting, just savages. I mean, that's absolute savages. That's how the enemy is depicted in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and in the Iraq War. I mean, this is, and I think in terms of the memory of Vietnam, I think, especially, how do people get their information about it now? How do young people get their information about it? I mean, for the most part, it's, textbooks, are very, milquetoast at best in how they describe the war and the anti-war movement. And of course, none of them say a word about, opposition inside the military. There's no real analysis of who the Vietnamese were, who the enemy was. So, it's these kind of popular images, I think, through movies and through, a lot of right-wing stories that show up on the internet, about it. So that's I think a big part of what's remembered. Yeah. I think what Jerry said is crucial about, the war at home being, the main thing remembered, and I think what Vivian's saying is absolutely true. This is what the main thing that's forgotten and completely erased over is that there was a right side and a wrong side in that war, and the United States was the wrong side.
We weren't on the right side.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for this very important conversation, which is very personal for the four of you, but also has incredible significance clearly for us all. That becomes very clear over the course of your conversation. So thank you very much, Vivian Rothstein and David Zeiger, for accepting our invitation to come speak with Tom WILBER and Jerry LEMBCKE about their book, Dissenting POWs. We really did come full circle in dealing with the subtitle from Vietnam's Hoa Lo Prison to America Today. And I think we leave with a sense that there are many open questions that we need to continue to engage. And this is really just the beginning. This is just scratching the surface of what could be a very rich field of study. And I think that everyone here would like to see that happen. So maybe, hopefully somebody who watches this will be encouraged to go even further with this research subject. And now I'd like to hand it over to Tom. In conclusion, Tom WILBER will be reading an excerpt of Dissenting POWs to conclude. Thank you very much.
The banishment of POW dissent from memory leaves a void in American political culture where new generations of uniformed war resistors will look for role models and civilian activists will look for allies in their efforts to end US wars of aggression. Filling that void is the mission of this book.